My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old, and I recently survived a high-risk coronary bypass surgery. But the real near-death experience was not on the operating table. It was waking up to find that my 4 children, the people I built a $40 million real estate empire for, had deliberately abandoned me, hoping I would die so they could steal everything. Before I tell you how I turned from a frail victim into the hunter who destroyed them, let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that loyalty and respect mean more than blood. The first thing I registered was the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It was a mechanical hollow sound that seemed to echo inside my very skull. Then came the pain. It was an agonizing, fiery sensation radiating from the center of my chest, exactly where the surgeons had sawed through my sternum to repair my failing heart. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit, my throat dry as sandpaper, my limbs heavy and sluggish from the anesthesia. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head toward the visitor sofa in the corner of the room. It was completely empty. There were no coats draped over the backrest, no half-empty coffee cups on the side table, no worried faces leaning in to check if I was awake. Just smooth, undisturbed vinyl. A sharp memory flashed through my fogged mind. It was the shared Google Calendar my children had presented to me with such exaggerated fanfare the night before my surgery. Thomas, my eldest son, had stood in my living room with his phone out, proudly showing me the color-coded schedule. Rachel, Derek, and Megan had all chimed in, promising 12-hour shifts by my bedside. "We have got you, Dad," Thomas had said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You will not be alone for a single minute. We are going to make sure you have everything you need." It was a comforting thought as I faced a procedure with a significant mortality rate. Yet as I stared at the empty sofa, the stark contrast between their grand promises and the deafening silence of this sterile hospital room began to sink in. I tried to convince myself that they were just down in the cafeteria, or perhaps talking to the surgeon in the hallway, to get updates on my recovery. I closed my eyes and drifted back to sleep, fully expecting to wake up to the sound of my daughter Megan's voice or Derek complaining about the terrible hospital food. But when I woke up again, hours later, the room was still entirely empty. The shadows had lengthened, signaling the arrival of evening. Day 1 bled into day 2. The physical agony of a sliced sternum and the tubes snaking out of my body was excruciating, but the psychological conflict of abandonment was beginning to eclipse the physical pain entirely. Every time the heavy wooden door creaked open, my heart would flutter with a naive, desperate hope. I expected to see Thomas marching in with his confident stride, or Rachel rushing over with a worried, tear-streaked face. But it was never them. It was always just a nurse, a respiratory therapist, or an orderly bringing in a tray of tasteless food. I asked the staff if anyone had called the front desk asking about my condition. "No, Mr. Harrison," a young nurse replied, gently avoiding my gaze. "But you have your cell phone right there on the tray table. You can call them if you like." I reached for my phone with trembling, bruised hands. The screen lit up. No text messages, no missed calls, no voicemails. Just a blank screen reflecting my own tired, gaunt face. I did not want to be the needy father begging for attention, so I told myself they were just incredibly busy. They were managing my commercial properties, keeping the real estate business afloat while I was incapacitated. They were handling my empire just like I had taught them to do. It was a plausible lie I fed myself to keep the rising tide of panic at bay. By day 7, the reality of my isolation became impossible to ignore. The doctors moved me out of the intensive care unit and into a standard recovery room. The grueling physical therapy began. I had to relearn how to walk, clutching a specialized heart pillow tightly to my chest every time I coughed to keep my sternum from splitting open. I shuffled slowly down the long, linoleum-floored corridors, dragging my heavy IV pole beside me. As I walked, I could not help but look through the open doorways of the other patients' rooms. I saw elderly men and women surrounded by their children and grandchildren. I heard the soft hum of family conversations, the rustle of gift bags, the scent of smuggled-in home-cooked meals. Every glimpse of familial love felt like a physical blow. I had provided for my children my entire life. I had paid for their elite college educations, funded their luxury weddings, and handed them massive down payments for their expensive suburban homes. Yet here I was, a 70-year-old man fighting for breath and taking my first agonizing steps completely alone. On the 10th day, Nurse Ramirez came into my room to change my bandages. She was a kind, observant woman who had treated me with nothing but gentle respect since I arrived. As she carefully peeled the medical tape away from my chest, she paused and looked at me with a deep, sympathetic expression. "Mr. Harrison," she began hesitantly, holding a clipboard against her chest. "Administration needs a family member to sign these extra billing forms for your post-operative care. We have tried reaching out to the emergency contacts on your file, but all the numbers go straight to voicemail. Do you have anyone else in the state?" The question hit me like a bullet. Do you have anyone in the state? I had 4 children living within a 20-mile radius of this very hospital. 4 adult children who were currently driving cars I financed and living in homes I had bought for them. I felt a hot, shameful flush rise to my cheeks. I swallowed the thick lump of pride and humiliation lodged in my throat. "I will handle the paperwork myself, Nurse Ramirez," I said, keeping my voice as steady and emotionless as possible. "Just leave the clipboard on the table." The silence in my room over the next few days felt heavier than lead. It was a suffocating, oppressive weight. The realization was no longer just a dark suspicion. It was an undeniable, glaring fact. My children had abandoned me. They had dropped me off at the doors of the cardiology wing and simply walked away. They did not care if I survived the bypass. In fact, the absolute lack of communication suggested something far more sinister. They were perhaps waiting for the hospital to call them with bad news. They were waiting for me to die. Finally, day 15 arrived. It was the day of my discharge. The attending physician came in, handed me a stack of prescriptions, and gave me a list of strict instructions for my home recovery. "You need to take it very easy, Mr. Harrison," the doctor warned me. "Your heart is recovering, but you are still in a highly vulnerable state. Make sure your family helps you with the stairs and your daily medications." I nodded silently, offering a tight, polite smile. I did not have the energy or the dignity left to tell him that there was no family waiting for me. I dressed myself with agonizing slowness. I pulled on the same clothes I had been wearing the day the ambulance rushed me away from my estate. The fabric hung loosely on my diminished frame. I packed my few personal belongings into a thin plastic hospital bag. As a nurse wheeled me down to the main entrance in a wheelchair, the hospital staff looked at me with silent pity. "Is someone coming to pick you up, sir?" the front desk attendant asked. I looked her right in the eye and lied. "Yes, they are pulling the car around now." I stood up from the wheelchair, clutching my chest, and pushed through the sliding glass doors into the brutal reality of a freezing Chicago winter. The biting wind whipped against my face and cut straight through my thin jacket, chilling my aching sternum. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the busy streets in blinding white. I stood on the curb, shivering uncontrollably, clutching my pathetic plastic bag. I pulled out my cell phone and ordered a cheap Uber. 10 minutes later, I climbed into the back seat of a stranger's car. The driver did not say a word, simply following the GPS directions toward my suburban estate. I leaned my head against the cold window, watching the snow-covered city blur past. I was a man who possessed a fortune of $40 million. I commanded hundreds of employees and owned blocks of commercial real estate. But sitting in the back of that cramped sedan, I realized that I was completely, utterly alone in the world. The pain in my chest was nothing compared to the cold, hard realization settling into my soul. I was going back to an empty house, but the war for my empire had just begun. The ride from City General Hospital to the northern suburbs was a torturous blur of gray slush and blinding white flurries. I sat in the back of the freezing, poorly heated sedan, clutching my thin plastic hospital bag tightly against my chest. Every minor bump in the asphalt, every sudden stop at a traffic light, sent a jolt of pure fire through my sternum. It was exactly where the surgeons had sawed through my ribcage to bypass my failing arteries just over 2 weeks ago. When the driver finally pulled up to the grand wrought iron gates of my estate, I barely had the physical strength left to push the car door open. I thanked the driver quietly, stepping out into the biting winter wind. The taillights of the car quickly faded into the heavy snow, leaving me standing completely alone in front of the massive stone pillars I had commissioned 20 years ago. This was my fortress. It was $8 million of prime suburban real estate paid for, with decades of relentless sweat, shrewd investments, and endless sleepless nights. Now I was standing outside of it like a common trespasser. I shuffled toward the illuminated keypad mounted on the left stone pillar, my fingers stiff and aching from the bitter cold. I pressed my bare thumb against the frozen metal digits, entering the familiar 6-digit sequence that had opened these gates for over a decade. The machine emitted a sharp, flat beep. A red light flashed abruptly on the small digital screen. Access denied. I paused, my breath pluming in the freezing air, staring blankly at the glowing red text. My mind still sluggish from the residual painkillers and the sheer exhaustion of the journey, desperately tried to process the rejection. Perhaps my freezing fingers had simply slipped on the wet keys. I took a slow, painful breath, stabilizing my shaking hand against the stone, and carefully typed the numbers again. It was the birth year of my late wife, followed by the year we founded the real estate company. It was a code that was etched into the very fabric of my existence. Another sharp beep pierced the quiet night. Access denied. A deep, unsettling chill began to spread through my veins, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the brutal winter storm. The security system of this estate was hardwired directly into the main server inside the house. The access code could not randomly reset due to a power outage or a system glitch. It had to be manually changed from the master console in the living room. I stood in the snow, the wind howling around my ears, feeling the fresh stitches on my chest pull and burn with every violent shiver. Why would my children deliberately change the primary security code while I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from open heart surgery? I had 2 choices. I could stand out here on the pavement and freeze to death, or I could find another way into my own home. Dragging my pathetic plastic bag, I turned away from the grand entrance and began to trudge toward the dense line of evergreen trees that bordered the western edge of the property. There was a narrow, unpaved maintenance path there primarily used by the landscaping crew during the summer months. Right now, it was completely buried under a foot of fresh, heavy snow. Every single step I took was a monumental battle against my own failing body. My legs felt like dead weight. The icy air burned my lungs, and the agonizing ache in my chest flared into blinding white-hot pain. I leaned heavily against the rough bark of a towering pine tree, gasping for breath, clutching the specialized heart pillow to my chest as the dark world spun violently around me. I had built this empire from absolute nothing. I had spent 50 years acquiring properties, managing logistics, dominating ruthless boardrooms, and providing a life of unparalleled luxury for my family. I refused to die of exposure, just 50 yards outside the very walls I had built to protect them. I forced myself forward, dragging my heavy boots through the deep snowdrift until I reached the side perimeter wall near the kitchen entrance. My hands scraped against the frozen brickwork, searching blindly in the dark. Decades ago, right after I bought this property, and long before the high-tech security cameras and smart locks were ever installed, I had buried a physical emergency key behind a loose brick near the drainage pipe. It was a paranoid habit from my early days on the streets, back when I had nothing and trusted no one. I prayed to whatever God was listening that the landscapers had never noticed it. My numb, bleeding fingers finally found the loose mortar. I pried the heavy brick loose and reached deep into the dark, damp cavity. My fingertips brushed against freezing, rough metal. I pulled it out, letting out a ragged, desperate gasp of relief. It was the heavy brass key covered in years of dirt and rust, but completely intact. I stumbled toward the side kitchen door, my vision blurring at the edges from the sheer physical exertion. The wind howled relentlessly, masking the loud sound of my ragged breathing. I slipped the rusty key into the deadbolt. It resisted for a terrible heart-stopping second before I forced it, with the last ounce of my strength, the heavy mechanism turning with a satisfying click. I pushed the solid oak door open and stepped into the dark mudroom, instantly enveloped by the blessed rushing warmth of the central heating system. I let the door click shut behind me and leaned my forehead against the cool plaster wall, closing my eyes tightly, just waiting for the intense burning in my chest to subside. I expected to be greeted by the hollow, echoing silence of an empty, worried house. I fully expected to find dust gathering on the expensive mahogany furniture, stacks of unopened mail piling up on the granite counter, and the quiet stillness of a home waiting for its master to return from the brink of death. But as the rushing sound of the winter wind faded from my ears, I realized the house was not silent at all. Faint, rhythmic notes drifted down the long hallway from the center of the estate. It was the smooth, upbeat sound of a jazz saxophone playing over the expensive surround sound system I had personally installed in the main living room. My brow furrowed in deep confusion. I took a slow, silent step out of the mudroom and moved cautiously toward the kitchen archway, the plastic bag still clutched in my trembling hand. That was when I heard it. The distinct, crisp pop of an expensive champagne cork. It was immediately followed by a loud burst of light-hearted laughter and the clear, unmistakable clinking of fine crystal glasses. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped from the freezing dark mudroom into the blinding warm light of the main kitchen. The sheer contrast between the brutal winter storm outside and the luxurious sanctuary inside was dizzying. The air was thick with the rich, savory aroma of roasted meats and expensive truffle oil. The soft melodic notes of a jazz saxophone poured from the hidden ceiling speakers I had installed when I built this wing of the estate. But what truly paralyzed me, standing there shivering in my soaked clothes, was the scene unfolding around the massive marble center island. My 4 children were gathered together, bathed in the warm glow of the custom pendant lights. Thomas, my eldest, stood at the head of the island, dressed in a sharp designer sweater, proudly holding a bottle of vintage champagne. It was a bottle from my private cellar, one I had specifically saved to celebrate the upcoming 50th anniversary of my real estate firm. Rachel was leaning against the counter, her manicured fingers delicately holding a crystal flute, tossing her head back in a moment of carefree laughter. Derek and Megan stood opposite them, smiling broadly, their glasses raised in a cheerful toast. They looked radiant. They looked triumphant. They looked like a family completely unburdened by grief or worry. As my wet boots squeaked against the polished hardwood floor, the sound cut through the jazz music. 4 heads snapped toward the doorway. The laughter died instantly, snatched from the air, as if a vacuum had been turned on. The joyous smiles melted off their faces, replaced by an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It was not the sudden, overwhelming relief of children seeing their father return safely from the brink of death. It was not shock mixed with tears of joy. It was pure, unadulterated panic. For a few agonizing seconds, no one moved. The crystal champagne glasses hovered in midair, trembling slightly in their hands. They stared at me as if a corpse had just crawled out of a grave and wandered into their private banquet. I stood there, water dripping from my matted gray hair, snow melting on my shoulders, leaning heavily against the doorframe just to remain upright. The physical exertion of dragging myself through the snowdrift had torn the delicate stitches under my bandages. I could feel the warm, sticky dampness of my own blood slowly seeping through the thin, cheap fabric of my hospital shirt, blooming into a dark red stain right over my heart. Megan was the first to recover from the paralyzing shock. The panic in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of exaggerated concern. She slammed her crystal glass down on the marble counter with a sharp clatter and rushed across the room. "Dad!" "Oh my God, Dad!" she screamed, her voice hitting an unnaturally high pitch. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a fierce, theatrical hug. The sudden physical impact sent a blinding shockwave of agony straight through my cracked sternum. I bit down on my lower lip so hard I tasted copper, forcing myself not to scream in pain. Her embrace felt completely hollow, a performance executed perfectly for an invisible audience. I could feel her rigid posture, the lack of genuine warmth in her touch. Thomas was right behind her. He did not offer a hug. He did not ask if I was in pain or if I needed a doctor. Instead, his face hardened into a mask of aggressive, stern authority. He reached out and snatched the pathetic plastic hospital bag from my trembling grip with unnecessary force. "What on earth are you doing here?" Thomas demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet kitchen. He glared at me, his eyes darting quickly to the blood blooming on my shirt, then back to my face. "Why did you sneak out of the hospital? Are you trying to kill yourself?" The sheer audacity of his attack left me momentarily breathless. The gaslighting began immediately. I had just survived a grueling high-risk coronary bypass. I had dragged my failing body through a blizzard because I had been abandoned. Yet in the span of 10 seconds, Thomas was already attempting to spin the narrative, desperately trying to frame me as the confused, irresponsible, and reckless old man who was causing unnecessary trouble for his loving family. I gently but firmly pushed Megan away, stepping fully into the bright kitchen light, so they could not avoid looking at my wretched state. Derek and Rachel remained frozen near the marble island. Rachel was nervously twisting the heavy, brilliant cut diamond ring on her right hand, a piece of jewelry I had purchased for her 30th birthday just last year. Derek would not even meet my eyes. He stared intensely at the polished floorboards, shifting his weight awkwardly from foot to foot like a guilty schoolboy. I did not sneak out. "Thomas," I said. My voice was raspy, dry, and weak, but the iron resolve beneath the words was unmistakable. I was officially discharged by the chief of cardiology after 15 days. I let the number hang in the warm, cinnamon-scented air. 15 days. 15 days of staring at a blank wall. I continued my gaze, moving slowly from Thomas to Megan to Rachel, and finally settling on Derek. 15 days of waiting for the children who stood in my living room and swore they would not leave my side for a single minute. 15 days of listening to the heavy hospital doors open, hoping to see my family, only to find a stranger bringing me a cup of water. "Dad, you do not understand." Rachel started, her voice shaking slightly, but I raised my bruised hand, cutting her off instantly. "I am not finished," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. The cold fury igniting in my chest was finally beginning to thaw my freezing limbs. I dragged my battered, bleeding body out of a stranger's car in the middle of a winter storm, only to find that my own security gate had rejected my thumbprint. My private access code, the code I have used since the day I built this fortress to protect all of you, had been manually erased from the main server. I took a slow, painful step toward the marble island. The smell of the vintage champagne made my stomach churn with a sickening mixture of rage and grief. I had to dig through the frozen dirt to find a rusty key I hid 30 years ago, I said, showing them my bleeding fingernails. I had to break into my own home just like a thief. And when I finally get inside expecting an empty, worried house, what do I actually find? I find my 4 children popping expensive corks and clinking glasses. I want answers right now. I want to know exactly why my gate code was changed. I want to know why you left me to rot for 15 days. Thomas squared his shoulders, took a long, slow breath, and prepared to deliver the perfect lie. Thomas stepped forward, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked me right in the eye, projecting an aura of righteous indignation. "Dad, you have to listen to me," he said, his voice dripping with fabricated sincerity. "We did not abandon you. We were at that hospital every single morning right at the crack of dawn. But the chief of medicine put the entire cardiovascular intensive care unit on a strict Tier 1 lockdown. There was a massive staph infection outbreak on the floor. It was a highly contagious, extremely resistant strain. Megan nodded vigorously, wiping away a non-existent tear from her meticulously powdered cheek. It was terrifying, Dad. The doctors said that with your compromised immune system and the open sternum wound, any outside exposure could be instantly fatal. They literally threatened to have us arrested if we tried to breach the ward. We had no choice but to stay back. Thomas took a step closer, placing a hand on his chest, as if he were the one in pain. We were in the lobby every single day, Dad. We fought with the security guards. I almost threw a punch at the hospital administrator. We begged them to let us just look at you through the glass observation window, but they outright refused. They told us the absolute best way to keep you alive was to stay completely away. We were going out of our minds with worry. We thought we might lose you. I listened to the smooth, rehearsed cadence of his voice. It was a brilliant, masterfully constructed lie. It utilized terrifying medical jargon, painted my children as desperate protective heroes, and conveniently erased their cruel absence. But a man who has spent 50 years negotiating ruthless corporate acquisitions knows exactly when he is being sold a fabricated narrative. If there had truly been a severe staff outbreak, Nurse Ramirez would have been wearing a full protective hazmat suit, not standard blue scrubs. The hospital administration would have notified me immediately. I felt a cold, heavy knot tighten deep in my stomach, but I kept my face entirely slack, and my eyes wide, projecting only a vulnerable, innocent confusion. But what about the security gate, I asked, letting my voice tremble slightly purposefully, allowing my genuine physical exhaustion to mask my sharp, calculating mind. Why was I locked out of my own property in the freezing snow? Rachel stepped in smoothly to cover the flank of their collective deception. She was wearing the $80,000 luxury watch I had personally bought for her, the diamonds catching the bright kitchen light. Dad, we had to change the master code 3 days ago, she said, her tone softening into a patronizing coo. There has been a terrifying string of armed robberies in the neighborhood. Professional crews hitting the large estates right down the street. The local police chief held an emergency meeting for the homeowner association to warn us. She reached out and gently touched my arm, her manicured fingers feeling like blocks of ice against my warm skin. They told everyone to immediately update all digital access points and completely clear the old entry logs. We were just trying to secure the perimeter of the property while you were recovering. We absolutely did not want you coming home to a compromised, dangerous house. We were going to program a brand new master key for you as soon as the hospital called to authorize your discharge. We had absolutely no idea they were letting you out today. They were strictly supposed to call us first. It was another seamless, perfectly calibrated excuse. It made perfect sense on the surface, but the foundational logic of the statement was entirely rotten to the core. If they had truly been at the hospital every single day, aggressively fighting with the administration, they would have known my exact medical chart and my discharge schedule. They would have been standing right by my hospital bed with a wheelchair ready. I looked at the 4 of them standing shoulder to shoulder in my kitchen, a united, impenetrable front of deceit. The pain radiating from my sliced sternum flared violently, acting as a sharp reminder of my current desperate physical weakness. I realized in that exact crystal-clear moment that I could not confront them right now. If I demanded the absolute truth in this kitchen, I would be one weak, bleeding 70-year-old man standing against 4 healthy, desperate predators inside a locked, isolated mansion. I needed time. I needed to understand the full depth and scope of this betrayal before I made a single tactical move against them, so I deliberately let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed a heavy, ragged, wet sigh to escape my pale lips, and I closed my eyes tightly, forcing a look of immense, pathetic relief onto my tired face. "Oh, thank God," I whispered softly, intentionally, letting my legs wobble slightly until I reached out and grabbed the smooth edge of the marble island for necessary support. Thank God. You have absolutely no idea what I was thinking. Laying in that sterile room for 2 straight weeks, just staring at the blank walls. I honestly thought you had all just moved on with your lives. I thought you simply did not care about me anymore. Megan gasped loudly. Dad. How could you ever think that? We love you. I know, I muttered, waving a weak hand. I am just so tired. The heavy pain medication messes with my head. It makes me confused. I am just a foolish, sick old man. I am truly sorry I doubted your loyalty. I am incredibly tired right now. The shift in the room was palpable. The thick tension instantly evaporated. I heard their collective exhale of profound relief. The rigid posture of my sons relaxed. The panic in my daughter's eyes vanished smoothly, replaced by a smug, self-satisfied calm. They believed I had swallowed their ridiculous lies hook, line, and sinker. They thought their father was just a frail, gullible shell of the corporate titan he used to be. "Let us get you upstairs to bed, Dad," Thomas said, his voice returning to its normal, confident boom. "You need to rest and let that chest wound heal. Derek, clean up the kitchen counter immediately. We do not need the place looking like a mess." Derek moved quickly. He grabbed a towel and began sweeping the empty champagne flutes off the table. As his elbow knocked a thick folder open, papers spilled across the polished oak wood. My eyes, honed by decades of poring over dense contracts, instantly locked onto the scattered documents. It was not a pile of medical bills. It was a detailed land surveyor zoning map. It was a precise schematic of my $8 million estate. Slashed across the map were bold red subdivision lines. The surveyors had carved up my pristine property, splitting my home into 6 distinct commercial subdivisions. They were not waiting for me to die. They were tearing my legacy apart piece by piece over a celebratory glass of champagne. I allowed Thomas and Derek to assist me up the grand staircase to my suite. I played the exhausted patriarch flawlessly, leaning heavily on the mahogany banister, dragging my feet, and letting out pathetic groans with every step. My sons exchanged arrogant glances over my bowed head. They deposited me into my large bed, pulling the duvet over my shivering legs with mock tenderness. Megan brought me water and a pain pill, kissing my forehead with cold lips, whispering for me to get some rest. They turned off the lamps and closed the oak door. I waited in the suffocating darkness. I did not swallow the pill, hiding it under my tongue and spitting it into a tissue the second the door clicked shut. I lay there in the pitch-black room, staring at the vaulted ceiling, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my freshly sutured sternum. The image of that zoning map burned behind my eyelids. They were subdividing my estate. They were carving up the spoils of my life while my heart was still beating. I needed to know the absolute truth about the hospital. I needed to know how deep this conspiracy went. I watched the red digits of my digital alarm clock slowly tick forward. I waited until the house fell into absolute silence. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning. I waited until exactly 2 in the morning. The mansion was dead quiet save for the relentless howling of the winter blizzard rattling the thick window panes. Moving with agonizing slowness, I threw off the duvet. My chest screamed in protest, an ache threatening to buckle my knees, but the icy rage coursing through my veins kept me upright. I padded silently across the plush carpeting of my bedroom, placing each bare foot with calculated precision to avoid the creaking floorboards. I slipped into my ensuite bathroom and clicked the solid lock into place. The click sounded deafening in the quiet night, making me freeze and hold my breath, listening for any approaching footsteps in the hallway. Hearing nothing but the wind, I moved toward the massive walk-in shower. I twisted the polished silver handle, turning the hot water on full blast. The heavy spray hit the imported tiles with a loud, consistent hiss, creating a perfect curtain of white noise to mask my voice. Steam quickly filled the bathroom, fogging up the vanity mirrors and wrapping around me like a damp cloak. I sat down heavily on the edge of the porcelain bathtub, my breathing shallow and fast. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my discarded hospital trousers. My fingers trembled violently as I scrolled through my contacts. I found the extension for the intensive care unit front desk. I pressed call and held the phone against my ear, praying someone would answer. It rang 3 times. Then a familiar voice came through the speaker. Cardiology ward, this is Nurse Ramirez speaking. I closed my eyes, a wave of relief washing over me at the sound of her voice. Nurse Ramirez, it is Richard Harrison, I whispered urgently. I was discharged earlier today. There was a brief pause. Mr. Harrison, she said, her tone laced with genuine surprise. Are you all right? You sound out of breath. Are you experiencing chest pain? I am fine, I said quickly. But I need to ask you a very important question. I need you to be completely honest with me. My life might depend on it. The gravity in my voice translated through the phone because she went completely quiet. Go ahead, sir, she finally replied softly. I swallowed hard, staring through the thick steam at the blurry wall. My son Thomas told me that the chief of medicine placed your entire floor on a strict Tier 1 lockdown over the past 2 weeks. He claimed there was a massive staph infection outbreak. He said my children fought with security every single day in the lobby, but were strictly banned from seeing me. Was there a lockdown, Nurse Ramirez? The silence on the other end of the line was absolute stretching for several agonizing seconds. I could hear the faint sound of a heart monitor beeping in the background. Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice dropping to a shocked whisper. There has been no staph outbreak in this hospital for over 4 years. There was absolutely no visitor ban. The entire cardiovascular wing has been operating under standard visiting hours for the duration of your stay. My chest tightened painfully. The air in the bathroom suddenly felt impossibly thin, suffocating me. But I checked my phone, I pleaded, desperate for any logical explanation. No one called me. No one tried to reach me. I am so sorry, Mr. Harrison, Nurse Ramirez said, and I could hear the deep pity breaking her professional composure. On the very first night of your surgery, your son Thomas came to the front desk. He showed us his medical proxy paperwork. He explicitly ordered administration to place a strict block on your room phone and your personal cell network. He told the staff that you were highly agitated and that nobody, absolutely nobody, was allowed to disturb your peace. He said it was for your own safety. The cold, hard truth crashed directly into me. There was no medical emergency preventing them from seeing me. There was no heroic fight with hospital security guards. My eldest son had deliberately orchestrated my isolation. He had built an invisible cage around my hospital bed, ensuring I would be left completely alone, trapped with my despair, while they sat in my home dividing up my legacy. They had medically isolated me to buy themselves time. I thanked Nurse Ramirez sincerely and ended the phone call. I sat on the edge of the porcelain tub for a long time, letting the hot steam wash over my battered body. The fatherly love I harbored for my 4 children withered and died right there on the cold bathroom tile, replaced by a dark, consuming need for absolute retribution. I pushed myself up from the tub and reached into the shower, twisting the silver handle to shut off the rushing water. The loud hissing stopped, leaving a heavy ringing silence in its wake. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped back into the pitch-black darkness of my master bedroom. I paused, my eyes adjusting to the shadows. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air in the room felt disturbed, slightly shifted. I looked toward the heavy oak dresser near the window. I placed my leather wallet on the far left corner of that dresser exactly before I went into the bathroom. I had aligned its edge perfectly with the grain of the wood, an old meticulous habit of mine. Now, in the faint moonlight filtering through the heavy curtains, I could clearly see that my wallet was no longer flush with the edge. It had been moved exactly 2 inches to the right. The flap was slightly ajar. Someone had just been inside my bedroom, silently searching through my pockets while I was in the shower. The morning sun filtered slowly through the heavy curtains, casting pale, elongated shadows across my cold bedroom floor. But it brought absolutely no warmth to the freezing reality of my current situation. I lay perfectly still under the thick duvet, silently listening to the muffled sounds of my ungrateful children moving about. The violation of my privacy the night before cemented my resolve. Someone had rummaged through my wallet, while I was washing the blood from my chest. They were checking my credit cards, or perhaps searching for a safe combination. I knew if I confronted them with anger, they would accelerate whatever malicious plan they had set in motion. I needed to remain invisible in plain sight. I needed them to believe their father was a broken, exhausted old man, barely clinging to life. I pressed the intercom button on my nightstand. When Megan answered, I let my voice drop to a frail, trembling whisper. I asked her to bring the spare wheelchair up from the basement, claiming the walk through the snow had taken a severe toll on my heart, and I did not have the strength to stand. Megan cooed sympathetically, promising to send Derek right up. 10 minutes later, my youngest son wheeled the chair into my room. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply checked his bright phone screen while I went through the incredibly agonizing, painfully slow process of transferring my aching, bruised body from the mattress to the chair. I groaned softly, clutching my chest pillow, playing the helpless invalid to perfection. Derek pushed me down the carpeted hallway and guided the wheelchair into the glass elevator. As the doors opened, I began a silent, meticulous observation. The house felt subtly different. Expensive artifacts had been shifted. Stacks of unfamiliar paperwork rested on the console tables. My children were treating my estate like an inherited playground. Rachel was sitting in the formal dining room, casually flipping through a fashion magazine while sipping artisanal coffee. I asked Derek to wheel me closer so I could join her. As she reached out to offer a patronizing pat on my shoulder, the sleeve of her silk blouse slid back. My eyes instantly locked onto her wrist. She was wearing a brand new rose gold Patek Philippe watch. The brilliant cut diamonds caught the morning light sparkling with sickening intensity. I recognized the specific model immediately. It retailed for exactly $80,000. Just 4 weeks ago, Rachel had sat in my study sobbing uncontrollably, begging me for a loan because she was 3 months behind on her mortgage. She claimed she had no discretionary income left to feed her children. Yet here she was, sporting a timepiece that cost more than most people earned in a year. Before I could process the sheer audacity of Rachel's luxury purchase, a loud, boastful voice echoed from the adjoining sunroom. Derek was pacing back and forth in front of the bay windows, speaking animatedly into his cell phone. I held up a trembling hand signaling Rachel to be quiet, pretending the noise was hurting my sensitive head. In reality, I was straining to listen. Derek let out a booming, arrogant laugh. "I am telling you, man, the drought is officially over," he said, his voice dripping with unbearable smugness. "You can tell the guys at the club that my markers are completely covered. We just got a massive cash injection. The liquid assets are totally secured. I am wiring the full 200 grand this afternoon. Yes, you heard me. The whole thing is cleared. We are back in the game." My hands gripped the armrests of my wheelchair with white-knuckled intensity. A massive cash injection. $200,000 to clear gambling markers. Rachel's $80,000 watch. My children had not just taken over my house. They were rapidly hemorrhaging an astronomical amount of cash. But from where my personal bank accounts were heavily fortified with strict daily transfer limits, they could not possibly liquidate my private funds without triggering security alerts to my email and phone. Unless they had bypassed my personal security entirely. Thomas walked into the dining room, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, looking every bit the master of the estate. "Thomas," I called out, letting my voice waver pitifully. He turned toward me, a tight, forced smile plastered across his face. "Good morning, Dad," he said smoothly. "How is the chest feeling today? We have a private nurse coming later." "It aches terribly," I whispered, leaning back against the chair. "But I have a favor to ask. I need a specific legal document from my private home study. It is the original deed to the commercial property on Fifth Avenue. I just remembered a zoning clause I need to review for the upcoming lease renewal. Could you fetch it for me? The file is in the third drawer of my mahogany desk." Thomas did not blink. He walked over to the coffee machine, poured himself a fresh cup, and turned back with an expression of mild inconvenience. "Oh, I am sorry, Dad," he casually replied. The lock jammed completely last week. The security company said the internal motherboard fried due to a power surge. I had to replace it for security purposes. The technicians are still calibrating the new keycards, so we actually cannot get in there right now. Do not worry about the lease. I am handling all the commercial renewals while you recover. He patted me on the shoulder and walked briskly out of the room, leaving me sitting in the center of the dining area. My blood ran completely ice-cold in my veins. That electronic lock had not jammed. It was military-grade, built to withstand severe tampering. Thomas had deliberately changed the lock to deny me access to my own private sanctuary. The true horror of his casual lie washed over me like a tidal wave of crushing realization. They were not just keeping me out of my office to hide their unauthorized financial paperwork. My private study contained a heavy fireproof floor safe hidden beneath the Persian rug. Inside that safe was my master will. It explicitly left 80% of my $40 million empire to my late wife's preferred children's charity, with only minor, tightly controlled trust funds allocated to my 4 children. They had discovered the existence of that master will. By changing the locks and physically barring me from entering the study, they deliberately isolated the only essential document standing between them and my total fortune. They were systematically erasing my entire existence and actively plotting to completely invalidate my hard-earned legacy. They viciously trapped me in severe weakness, isolated me from my dedicated medical advocates, locked me out of my private files, and brutally hijacked the operational capacity of my entire life. I sat perfectly still in the wheelchair, completely surrounded by the beautiful things I had bought for them, fully realizing I was a prisoner in my own home. They thought I was a helpless old man drifting quietly toward the grave. They had absolutely no idea they had just awakened a ruthless, calculating monster. I spent the rest of that agonizing morning trapped in my wheelchair, playing the role of the defeated patriarch to absolute perfection. I nodded at Thomas as he lectured me about resting. I smiled weakly at Megan when she brought me a bowl of lukewarm soup. Internally, a blazing inferno of pure, unfiltered vengeance consumed my every waking thought. I needed to move, and I needed to do it without triggering their radar. Around 2 in the afternoon, the heavy snowfall finally subsided into a light, powdery dusting. I rang a small silver bell Megan had left on my side table. When she strolled in checking her manicure, I put on my best performance of frail vulnerability. I told her the indoor air was making my chest tight, and I requested a walk in the rear garden to clear my lungs. Megan rolled her eyes, muttering something about the inconvenience, but eventually bundled me in a wool coat and pushed my wheelchair out through the French doors onto the cleared stone patio. She locked the brakes, wrapped a thick tartan blanket around my trembling legs, and immediately retreated inside to escape the biting chill, leaving me entirely alone. That was exactly what I needed. I waited until I heard the heavy glass door slide shut. The winter air was sharp and cold against my face, but it felt incredibly clarifying. I scanned the perimeter of my estate. The intricate network of security cameras stared down at me from the eaves, but I knew their precise blind spots. I had designed the entire system myself over a decade ago. I unlocked the wheelchair brakes with stiff fingers and slowly wheeled myself down the ramp, moving away from the main patio and toward the hedges that lined the eastern property line. Through the heavy, frosted, wrought iron security fence, I finally spotted Hector, the head landscaper, who maintained the grounds for several properties in our exclusive subdivision. He was scraping ice off his utility truck, his breath pluming in the air. I knew I could not use the home landline, and my personal cell phone was undoubtedly compromised or monitored by my children. I needed an invisible, completely untraceable lifeline to the outside world. I pushed the heavy wheels of my chair through the snow, gritting my teeth against the pain in my sternum. When I reached the edge of the fence shielded from the house by the evergreen branches, I called out softly to the landscaper. Hector jumped, dropping his ice scraper in surprise. He hurried over to the iron bars, his face etched with deep concern as he took in my pale appearance. "Mr. Harrison," he whispered urgently, taking off his work gloves. "We all heard you were in the hospital. Are you all right, sir?" Should you be out here in this freezing weather? Well, I did not have the time or the luxury to explain the sinister reality of my situation. Hector, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I need a massive favor, and I need you to ask absolutely no questions. I reached into the pocket of my wool coat. I always carried a money clip with emergency cash, a paranoid habit from my early days hustling in the brutal Chicago real estate market. I pulled out 5 $100 bills and pushed them through the gaps in the iron fence. I need to buy your personal cell phone right now, I told him, looking directly into his eyes. And I need you to leave the property immediately and tell no one you saw me. Hector looked at the cash, then back at my face. He was a smart man, a survivor. He recognized the sheer desperation radiating from my gaze. Without uttering a single word of protest, he reached into his canvas jacket, pulled out a cheap, scuffed smartphone, and handed it through the bars. I shoved the crumpled money into his calloused hand, nodded once in silent gratitude, and watched him turn and walk briskly back to his truck. As his loud diesel engine roared to life and the vehicle disappeared down the snowy street, I wheeled myself deeper into the concealing shadows of the tall hedges. My hands were shaking violently from the freezing temperature and the surging adrenaline. I stared at the cracked screen of the cheap mobile device. I dialed a specific unlisted phone number from pure memory. It was the direct, secure line to Mitchell, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney. Mitchell and I had built my real estate empire together over the last 25 years. He was the only man in the corporate world I trusted with my life and my legacy. The line rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. Mitchell speaking. The sound of his voice nearly broke my composure. Mitchell. I breathed out, my voice thick with exhaustion and lingering shock. It is Richard. There was a long, absolute silence on the other end of the line. I thought the cheap connection had failed. Then a sharp gasp echoed through the tiny speaker. Richard Mitchell asked, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. Richard, is that actually you? Yes, I replied, wrapping the thick blanket tighter around my shivering shoulders. I am sitting in the freezing garden of my own house because my children have locked me out of my study and hijacked my life. I need your help immediately. Mitchell let out a string of vicious, breathless curses. Richard, he said, his tone laced with absolute horror and rising panic. Thomas stood before the entire executive board 13 days ago. He looked us all dead in the eye and swore you had suffered a massive surgical complication. He told the board you were lying in a medically induced coma with severe, irreversible brain damage. A fresh wave of nausea washed over me. A medically induced coma. My own flesh and blood had essentially declared me dead to the corporate world while I was fighting for my life in a sterile hospital bed. He completely locked down your entire estate. Mitchell continued, his voice rising in frantic urgency. He invoked a permanent emergency proxy clause to seize total control of your commercial assets. When I demanded to see your actual medical charts, he ordered security to escort me out of the building. Richard, your son fired me 10 days ago. They are liquidating everything you own. You are in extreme immediate danger in that house. I gripped the cheap plastic phone, the reality of my perilous situation solidifying into pure, unbreakable resolve. I know, Mitchell, I whispered coldly. I need to know exactly how they pulled this off, and I need to gather airtight evidence without them suspecting a single thing. I am trapped here. Mitchell did not hesitate for a second. We are going on the offensive right now, Richard. I am connecting you with Victor. He is a ruthless ex-federal private investigator who handled our worst corporate espionage cases. He operates completely off the grid, and he takes no prisoners. I am patching him through to this line right now. Stay perfectly quiet right there and do not hang up this phone now. I held my breath as a series of encrypted clicks echoed through the tiny speaker. A deep, gravelly voice broke the static. This is Victor, the man said, skipping any polite introductions. Mitchell briefed me on the secure line. You are operating in a hostile, locked-down environment, Richard. We need eyes and ears inside that house immediately, but I cannot simply knock on your front door. I need you to create a massive distraction. A localized crisis that forces your children to open the perimeter and pull their focus entirely away from the security feeds. I need a solid 20-minute window to bypass the external gates, access the servant entrance, and wire the interior. I stared at the frost clinging to the wrought iron fence, formulating a desperate plan. "I will give you your window," I whispered, my breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "I will make them open the gates. Give me exactly 1 hour to get back inside and set the stage. Be ready at the Northern Service Road." I ended the call and slipped the burner phone deep into the lining of my wool coat. I gripped the cold wheels of the chair and began the agonizing push back up the stone ramp. I maneuvered the wheelchair back through the French doors, locking them quietly behind me. The warmth of the house felt almost suffocating after the biting garden chill. I rolled myself into the main living room where Thomas, Megan, and Derek were huddled around the coffee table reviewing a thick stack of legal documents. I positioned myself near the heavy velvet drapes, ensuring I was highly visible. I took a shallow breath, dug deep into the lingering pain of my severed sternum, and initiated my performance. I let out a harsh, rattling cough. I followed it with another deeper and wetter, forcing my lungs to spasm. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair, leaned forward, and began to violently hack, gasping for air like a drowning man. The legal documents hit the floor with a loud slap. Thomas jumped up, his face draining of color. Megan screamed, covering her mouth with her hands. I escalated the fit, clutching my bandaged chest, making my eyes bulge and water. I let a thin string of saliva slip from the corner of my lips, ensuring I looked like a man on the absolute brink of a fatal cardiovascular collapse. "Dad!" Derek yelled, sprinting across the room and grabbing my shoulders. "Dad, breathe. Look at me." His panic was entirely genuine, but it was not born from a place of filial love. They needed me alive. If I died right there on the Persian rug before they finalized the subdivision permits and accessed my master will, their entire multi-million-dollar scheme would instantly evaporate into probate court. Thomas pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking violently. "I am calling Dr. Evans," he barked, pacing the floor. I kept coughing, but my mind logged the name immediately. Dr. Evans was not a cardiovascular specialist. He was a disgraced former corporate physician who owed my real estate firm a significant amount of money from a malpractice settlement 10 years ago. He was a paid lackey, a man Thomas could easily control and bribe to falsify medical records. He was the perfect compliant doctor to keep my true physical state off the official hospital grid. "Tell him to get here right now," Megan shrieked, fanning my face with a magazine. "Tell him to bypass the main gate security protocol." 40 minutes later, the heavy oak front doors swung open. Dr. Evans rushed into the grand foyer, carrying a battered black leather medical bag. He looked disheveled, sweating profusely despite the winter weather. Thomas and Derek dragged my wheelchair into the center of the foyer, barking frantic instructions. Megan hovered nervously, wringing her hands. The entire household was completely consumed by the chaotic spectacle of my fabricated medical emergency. No one was looking at the security monitors. No one noticed the faint metallic click echoing from the darkened kitchen corridor. Victor had seamlessly breached the servant entrance. While Dr. Evans shined a bright penlight into my eyes and pressed a cold stethoscope against my violently heaving back, a ghost was moving through my home. I knew Victor was a phantom. I knew he was swiftly and silently navigating the shadows of the estate. In less than 20 minutes, he bypassed the main network firewall, tapped directly into the primary router, and established a heavily encrypted, untraceable broadcast signal. He planted microscopic motion-activated cameras deep inside the molding of the living room and directly above the doorframe of my locked private study. Dr. Evans administered a mild sedative, assuring my terrified children that it was merely a severe panic attack brought on by physical exhaustion. As Derek and Thomas argued with the doctor about dosage levels in the foyer, I feigned complete exhaustion, letting my head loll against the back of the wheelchair. I felt a sudden, incredibly light pressure against the deep pocket of my wool coat. I did not move a single muscle. I did not open my eyes. I just let my arm rest naturally against the fabric, feeling the cold, rigid shape of a sleek digital tablet slipping silently into my pocket. Victor was gone as quickly as he had arrived, leaving absolutely no trace of his presence. My children eventually rolled me back to my master suite, utterly exhausted by the manufactured ordeal. They tucked me into bed, whispering quietly about how close they had come to losing their golden goose. The heavy oak door clicked shut, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. I waited until the house settled into a deep, unbroken silence. The digital clock glowing on my nightstand read exactly 3 in the morning. I pulled the heavy duvet over my head, creating a dark, secluded tent. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the slim black tablet Victor had successfully delivered. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen illuminated immediately, bathing my face in a pale, harsh blue light. I tapped the encrypted application icon, and a crisp, high-definition live feed materialized on the screen. It was the interior of my private study. The room was bathed in the green hue of night vision. I watched the screen with bated breath. The heavy doors of my study pushed open. Thomas and Derek walked into the room holding flashlights. They moved with absolute confidence, entirely unaware they were being recorded. They did not search the desk or the filing cabinets. They walked straight to the center of the room, shoving the heavy Persian rug aside to expose the fireproof floor safe. My blood ran completely cold as I watched my eldest son crouch down on the hardwood floor. He did not use a drill. He did not use a blowtorch. He simply reached out and began spinning the metal dial. I watched his fingers move with terrifying precision. He knew the sequence. He entered the final digit, pulled the heavy steel handle, and the safe swung wide open. They had already cracked it. I watched the grainy green screen as Thomas reached deep into the fireproof cavity of the floor safe. He pulled out the thick, embossed leather folder containing my master will. My eldest son flipped through the heavy parchment pages with chilling casualness, running his index finger down the precise legal clauses that dedicated the vast majority of my $40 million empire to children in need. He shook his head, muttered something derogatory to Derek, and callously tossed the document back into the dark steel vault. They did not even bother to read the provisions I had left for them. The sheer entitlement radiating from their actions made the surgical incision across my chest burn with phantom fire. Thomas spun the dial to lock the safe, kicked the heavy Persian rug back into place, and the two brothers walked out of the study, plunging the hidden camera feed back into silent, undisturbed stillness. I needed to see the broader picture. Victor was not just a surveillance expert. He was a digital phantom who specialized in absolute data extraction. Before leaving the estate, he had synced the tablet to a secure, untraceable server that bypassed all of Thomas and his amateur security protocols. I swiped across the glowing glass screen, closing the live video application and opening the encrypted corporate portal Victor had provided. My heart hammered against my ribs as lines of dense code cascaded down the display, instantly tearing through the heavily fortified firewalls of my primary logistics company. For decades, I had run a perfectly clean, highly profitable supply chain empire. I treated my employees like family, ensuring their futures were completely secure. Now, as the shadow ledgers loaded onto my screen, the sheer magnitude of my children and their financial devastation was laid completely bare. The numbers were catastrophic. The massive cash injection Derek had bragged about earlier that morning was barely a drop in a vast, bottomless ocean of stolen wealth. Thomas had not merely redirected a few dividend payments to cover Derek and his degenerate gambling habits. He had methodically and aggressively leveraged the entire operational framework of the logistics company. I stared at the glowing spreadsheets, my breath hitching in my throat, as the horrible reality materialized before my eyes. Thomas had secured massive, high-interest corporate loans using the firm's physical fleet of trucks and commercial warehouses as direct collateral. He had forged my digital signature on dozens of binding promissory notes, effectively mortgaging the entire foundation of the business to shadowy private equity firms that specialized in hostile takeovers. But the absolute worst betrayal, the unforgivable sin that made my hands shake with homicidal rage, was hidden in the employee benefit ledgers. The blue-collar workers, the loyal men and women who had spent 20 years driving my trucks, managing my warehouses, and building my wealth with their sweat and broken backs, were being robbed blind. Thomas had systematically drained the company pension fund. Millions of dollars carefully invested and protected for their quiet retirements had been illegally siphoned through a complex web of offshore shell corporations. My stomach churned violently. My children were stealing from innocent, hard-working families to fund their disgusting, excessive greed. I traced the digital breadcrumbs following the stolen pension funds as they flowed out of the corporate accounts and vanished into a series of highly obscured private holding companies. Victor and his software shredded the digital masks, revealing the true beneficiaries of the stolen wealth. It was not just Thomas lining his own pockets. The vast majority of the pilfered retirement money was being funneled directly to a notoriously violent underground lending syndicate operating out of the city Port District. I pulled up the attached transfer memos, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted notes. The payments were specifically earmarked to cover massive outstanding debts incurred by my precious daughter Rachel. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Rachel had not just been struggling to pay a simple residential mortgage. The $80,000 luxury watch I had seen on her wrist that morning was a glittering symptom of a deeply terrifying reality. She had somehow managed to owe millions to loan sharks, dangerous men who broke legs and burned down houses when they were not paid on time. She had leveraged her own life, and Thomas was using the blood, sweat, and future security of my loyal employees to bail her out of the lethal consequences. They were bleeding my empire dry to save themselves from the monsters they had invited into their lives. I sat in the darkness, the pale blue light of the tablet illuminating my face, feeling a profound, terrifying calm settle over my racing heart. The physical pain in my chest faded into the background, entirely eclipsed by the absolute necessity of my upcoming vengeance. I was no longer a father dealing with ungrateful children. I was a corporate titan facing a hostile, malicious threat that sought to destroy innocent people. I began to swipe rapidly through the internal communication servers, downloading every single forged contract, every illegal transfer receipt, and every damning email thread they had foolishly exchanged on the company network. I needed an ironclad case. I needed enough indisputable evidence to send all four of them to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. As I archived a particularly incriminating chain of messages between Thomas and the loan syndicate, a sharp, sudden chime interrupted the silence of my bedroom. A new high-priority notification popped up in the corner of the tablet screen. It was an intercepted message from a private, encrypted group chat my four children were using to coordinate their conspiracy. The sender was Megan. I tapped the alert, opening the message string. The words glowed brightly against the dark background, sending a fresh, icy chill directly down my spine. The message was brief, clinical, and completely devoid of any human empathy. It read, "The notary is ready for tomorrow. Once he signs the medical waiver, it is done." The stark reality of their cold and calculated betrayal settled over me like a thick, heavy blanket of suffocating winter frost here tonight. I stared at the glowing letters until they blurred together. A medical waiver. They were not waiting for me to naturally succumb to my surgical wounds, and they were not going to leave my legal standing to chance. The puzzle pieces instantly slammed into place, completing a horrifying picture of their final desperate gambit. A medical waiver properly notarized and filed with the estate lawyers would legally declare me mentally unfit and physically incapable of managing my own affairs. It would grant Thomas immediate, uncontested power of attorney over my life, my health decisions, and my entire $40 million fortune. They were going to force me to sign away my existence tomorrow morning. And if I refused, or if I revealed that I knew the truth, they had already proven they were willing to do absolutely anything to secure the money. They were going to corner a sick, isolated old man and strip him of his humanity. They thought they had won. They thought the game was already over. The heavy reinforced steel door of the floor safe groaned softly as Thomas pulled it wide open. I held the tablet closer to my face in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom, my breath catching as I watched my sons violate the most secure space in my home. Thomas did not bother to look for the master will. He reached past the leather folders and pulled out a crystal decanter from the back of the vault. It was my prized 50-year-old single malt scotch, a bottle I had sworn to open only on my 80th birthday. Derek let out a low, predatory whistle as Thomas placed the priceless decanter onto the polished surface of my mahogany desk. Thomas retrieved 2 crystal tumblers from the adjacent cabinet. I listened, paralyzed by the sheer audacity as the rich amber liquid splashed into the heavy glasses. The crisp clink of crystal meeting crystal echoed loudly through the audio feed. They were celebrating their absolute victory while standing directly over the blueprints of my impending financial demise. I watched them sink into my tufted leather armchairs, kicking their expensive designer shoes up onto my pristine desk. Megan and Rachel walked into the frame a few moments later. Megan was holding a lit cigarette, casually flicking the gray ash into a priceless porcelain bowl I kept on the side table. I cranked the volume on my encrypted tablet, pressing the small speaker tightly against my ear to ensure I did not miss a single spoken syllable. They began to discuss the logistics of the estate subdivision. Thomas confidently outlined how he had already bribed the local zoning commissioner to expedite the commercial permits. Derek bragged about how easily he had manipulated the bank into accepting the forged corporate collateral. They spoke with the cold, detached efficiency of seasoned corporate raiders dismantling a bankrupt rival firm. Every word they spoke was a jagged knife twisting deep into my chest, but I forced myself to carefully listen to every single word. The conversation took a sudden, chilling turn. Rachel took a long sip from her glass of stolen scotch and sighed contentedly. "I genuinely thought he was going to ruin absolutely everything today," she murmured, her voice laced with profound annoyance. "When he walked through that kitchen door, I thought I was going to have a massive heart attack. I thought the entire subdivision deal was going to blow up right in our own faces." Megan let out a sharp, cruel giggle that sounded like shattering glass. "Oh, relax, Rachel," Megan said, waving her cigarette dismissively. "We had the entire situation perfectly under control. Honestly, I still cannot believe how incredibly easy it was to buy ourselves the extra time we needed. I mean, I cannot believe that pathetic, miserable medical assistant actually took the $50,000 in cash." The cold air in my dark bedroom suddenly felt as thick and heavy as wet concrete. I stopped breathing. My grip on the tablet tightened until my knuckles turned completely white. I stared at the glowing green screen, desperately hoping I had somehow misheard her cruel words. Slipping him those extra sedatives bought us a whole extra week. Megan continued her tone, so incredibly casual, she could have been discussing a minor adjustment to a grocery list. "Dropping 50 grand to keep the old man completely unconscious was the absolute best investment we ever made. Did you see him when he finally woke up? He did not even remotely know his own name for 3 straight agonizing days. It was actually kind of pathetic to watch him babble like a confused toddler." Thomas chuckled darkly, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "It was a necessary tactical expense, Megan. If he had woken up on schedule, he would have called Mitchell almost immediately. We needed him entirely incapacitated so we could bypass his biometric security protocols and access the shadow servers. That extra week of induced coma was the only reason I was able to drain the pension funds and secure the commercial loans before he realized what was actually happening." My tablet slipped from my trembling, sweating hands, landing softly on the thick duvet. I did not bother to pick it up. The green light illuminated the ceiling of my bedroom, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the plaster. I lay there staring into the absolute darkness as a horrifying, sickening realization washed over my entire being. My agonizing, prolonged stay in the intensive care unit had not been the unfortunate result of a difficult cardiovascular surgery. The terrible, vivid hallucinations that had plagued my mind, the terrifying inability to speak or move my incredibly heavy, useless limbs. Absolutely none of that was a natural medical complication. It was intentional, calculated, and entirely malicious. My own flesh and blood had actively conspired to chemically torture me. They had paid a corrupt medical professional to continually pump powerful, dangerous sedatives into my failing bloodstream. They had intentionally kept me trapped in a terrifying twilight state of a medically induced coma, risking permanent brain damage simply to buy themselves enough time to steal my life. I closed my eyes, remembering the sheer terror of waking up in that sterile, cold hospital bed. I remembered crying out for my children, begging the nurses to find them, completely unaware that the very people I was crying for were the ones paying to keep me strapped to that bed. They had traded my health, my sanity, and very nearly my life for commercial real estate permits and offshore bank accounts. In that silent, freezing moment, a profound and irreversible transformation occurred deep within my soul. The lingering remnants of fatherly affection, the desperate hope that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding, completely evaporated. The biological bond that tethered me to the four monsters drinking my scotch in the room below was instantly severed. They were no longer my children. They were hostile, lethal parasites who had fed on my love and were now actively trying to consume my corpse. A terrifying, absolute calm settled over my battered body. The agonizing throb of my healing sternum vanished, completely replaced by a cold, radiating energy. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel the crushing grief of a betrayed parent. I felt pure vengeance. They had mistaken my profound love for pathetic weakness. They had assumed my advancing age made me an easy target. They had foolishly forgotten that I was the very same man who had ruthlessly built a massive multi-million-dollar empire from the cold, unforgiving dirt of the violent Chicago streets. I had spent 50 years crushing corporate enemies, dismantling hostile takeovers, and burying aggressive competitors. My children thought they were playing a game of chess against a dying, oblivious old man. They had absolutely no idea they had locked themselves inside a cage with an apex predator. I reached down, picked up the glowing tablet, and watched them laugh on the screen. The twisted game they started was no longer about simple survival. It was about absolute, total annihilation. I would not just stop their plans. I would utterly destroy their entire lives. The pale morning light bled through the velvet curtains of my master suite, signaling the beginning of what my children believed would be their absolute triumph. I had spent the entire night lying still in the suffocating darkness, letting the horrifying reality of their chemical torture crystallize into a weaponized, unbreakable focus. I smoothed out the duvet and forced my rigid, aching muscles to adopt the pathetic, trembling posture of a broken man. When Megan knocked softly and opened the door to check on me, she found exactly what she expected to see: a frail, exhausted father. She smiled a sweet smile, brought me my morning medications, and helped me into the wheelchair. She wheeled me out to the main dining room where my 4 children were already gathered around the massive oak table. Thomas was at the head of the table, sipping his espresso, vibrating with poorly concealed anticipation. As Derek pushed my chair into an empty spot, Thomas leaned forward with an exaggerated expression of deep, incredibly fake concern. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with that exact same fabricated sincerity. "You look a little bit better today, but we are not taking any chances with your recovery." I took the liberty of arranging a special house call. I let my head tilt slightly to the side, feigning a slow, confused processing of his words. "A house call," I mumbled, making my voice sound raspy and weak. From who? Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "This is a highly specialized administrative doctor. He works directly with the hospital board and your insurance providers. Because your discharge was sudden, the administration requires a formal verification of your ongoing outpatient care plan. He is just coming by to have you sign off on some routine Medicare release forms. Just a few basic signatures to ensure your physical therapy and prescription coverage continue without any annoying bureaucratic interruptions. We want to make sure you are completely taken care of." Rachel chimed in right on cue, reaching across the table to gently pat my trembling hand. "It will only take 5 minutes, Dad," she murmured. We are handling all the boring legal details so you do not have to stress your heart. I nodded slowly, letting a dull, compliant expression wash over my face. That sounds fine, I whispered, staring down at my lap. Thank you for taking care of everything. I felt bile rise in my throat as the words left my mouth, but I maintained the facade perfectly. Derek practically beamed, exchanging a triumphant glance with Megan. The trap was set. After breakfast, I asked to be wheeled back to my room for a brief rest. Once the heavy door clicked shut, and I was entirely alone, I moved to the closet, retrieving the cheap burner phone. The screen was already glowing with an incoming encrypted text message from Victor. I opened the application, my eyes scanning the detailed intelligence report. Victor had successfully intercepted the digital communications between Thomas and the man pretending to be a medical specialist. The message laid out the chilling, undeniable truth. The man arriving at my estate was not a doctor. He was a corrupt, heavily bribed public notary whom Thomas had used for shady acquisitions. And the documents he was bringing were not routine Medicare release forms. Victor had managed to pull the attached files. I stared at the tiny screen, reading the headers of the legal documents my children planned to slide under my pen. The first document was a comprehensive, legally binding, irrevocable power of attorney. It was drafted with incredibly broad language that would instantly transfer total control of my medical, personal, and financial decisions directly to Thomas. It contained specific clauses granting him the absolute authority to place me in a managed care facility against my will. But the second document was the true killing blow. It was a direct quitclaim deed transfer for my $8 million primary estate. They were not just taking control of my business and my health. They were legally stripping the very roof from over my head, transferring the property title directly to a holding company, controlled exclusively by the four of them. If I signed those papers, I would instantly become a penniless, powerless prisoner. They would pack me away into a high-security nursing facility by sunset, heavily medicated and completely silenced. I read the final line of Victor's text message. The notary is arriving at 10:30. I have all the external and internal recording feeds locked and actively recording to secure cloud servers. I am standing by on the perimeter. Let them spring the trap, Richard. I deleted the message, powered down the burner phone, and hid it back inside my coat. I walked over to the mirror above the vanity. I looked at the dark circles under my eyes, the pale tone of my skin, and the medical bandages visible beneath the collar of my shirt. I looked exactly like a victim. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump, practicing the vacant, compliant stare they so desperately wanted to see. The cold, dark void inside my chest pulsed with a terrifying, absolute clarity. I was completely ready. I pressed the intercom button and asked Derek to wheel me out to the grand living room. I told him I wanted to be comfortable when the medical specialist arrived. Derek happily obliged, wheeling my chair down the hallway and into the center of the massive sunlit room. He parked me precisely in the middle of the expensive Persian rug, directly in the optimal viewing angle of the microscopic camera Victor had planted in the molding the day before. Megan followed closely behind, carrying a thick wool blanket. She draped it carefully over my lap, tucking the edges around my legs with a sickening display of fake devotion. "Are you comfortable, Dad?" Megan asked, adjusting a pillow behind my neck. "This will all be completely over very soon." "I know it will," I replied, my voice a soft, fragile rasp. "I am perfectly fine right here." "Fine, right?" Thomas entered the living room a moment later, straightening his expensive silk tie. Rachel stood confidently by the grand stone fireplace, casually examining her absolutely perfect manicure. The four of them took their positions around the room, forming a loose, calculated perimeter around my wheelchair. They were completely boxing me in, ensuring I had absolutely no physical or psychological avenue of escape. The atmosphere in the grand living room grew incredibly thick and oppressive, suffocating, with unsaid intentions and a simmering, truly malicious greed. I sat perfectly still in the center of their predatory circle, my hands resting weakly on top of the wool blanket. I controlled my breathing, keeping it slow and shallow. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked methodically, marking the final seconds of their elaborate conspiracy. I waited patiently in the heavy silence, feeling the absolute, unbreakable certainty of my impending vengeance warming my freezing blood. Then suddenly, the heavy polished brass chime of the front doorbell echoed very loudly through the entire mansion. The hungry wolves were finally moving in for the ultimate kill. The heavy polished brass chime of the front doorbell echoed very loudly through the entire mansion. The hungry wolves were moving in for the ultimate kill. Megan gasped with exaggerated relief, smoothing down the front of her silk blouse before sprinting across the marble foyer to answer the door. Thomas remained standing beside my wheelchair, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set in a rigid, uncompromising line. He took a slow, deep breath, perfectly calibrating his facial expression to project the exact image of a deeply concerned, loving son. Rachel and Derek exchanged sharp, anxious glances across the room. The heavy oak front doors swung inward with a solid thud, letting in a bitter gust of freezing winter air. I kept my head bowed, letting my chin rest weakly against the thick wool blanket draped across my lap, capturing every single detail of the unfolding scene through the curtain of my gray hair. Footsteps clicked sharply against the imported marble flooring. Megan reappeared in the wide archway, leading a man carrying a battered leather briefcase. He attempted to project an aura of seasoned professional authority, but his execution was incredibly flawed. I recognized him instantly, and it took every ounce of my formidable willpower to suppress a bitter, mocking laugh. This was not a specialized medical administrator. This was Gregory Vance, Derek's former fraternity brother from his disastrous college years. Gregory had barely scraped his way through a notoriously corrupt law program and spent the last decade chasing ambulance sirens and filing fraudulent insurance claims. He wore an ill-fitting, cheap gray suit that wrinkled awkwardly at the shoulders, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his pale forehead. He looked absolutely terrified, gripping the handle of his briefcase so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Gregory stepped onto the plush Persian rug, his cheap rubber soles squeaking faintly against the expensive fabric. He stopped a few feet away from my wheelchair, his eyes darting frantically toward Thomas for silent reassurance. Thomas offered a curt, imperceptible nod. Gregory cleared his throat, a loud, grating sound in the quiet room. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Gregory said, his voice cracking slightly, before forcing it an octave lower to sound more commanding. "I am Dr. Vance, the primary administrative liaison for your cardiovascular care network. Your sudden discharge created severe logistical complications regarding your ongoing physical therapy authorizations and continuous prescription coverage. The hospital board requires your immediate signature on these routine compliance waivers to guarantee there is no sudden lapse in your essential medical care." He recited the entirely fabricated script with the stiff, unnatural cadence of a terrible amateur actor. I let out a low, rattling cough, pulling the thick wool blanket tighter around my shivering shoulders. I blinked slowly, projecting a hazy, heavily medicated confusion. "A doctor," I murmured, letting my voice trail off weakly into the cavernous space of the living room. "I do not remember seeing you at the hospital." Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his tight collar. "I work strictly behind the scenes in the administrative division, sir," he replied quickly, his eyes shifting away from my intense, covert scrutiny. "I ensure all the bureaucratic red tape is properly managed, so you can focus entirely on healing." Thomas stepped smoothly into my line of sight, completely blocking my view of the sweating fraud. He placed a warm, heavy hand on my trembling shoulder. "It is all right, Dad," Thomas said, his tone dripping with calculated manipulation. "Dr. Vance is here to help." Thomas gestured toward the expensive glass coffee table positioned directly in front of my wheelchair. Gregory practically lunged forward, eager to finish his part in this despicable charade. He placed his scuffed leather briefcase onto the pristine glass surface and snapped the brass latches open. The sharp metallic clicks sounded like a firing squad loading their rifles. Gregory pulled out a thick, densely packed stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He fanned the pages out across the table, revealing rows of complicated text and several brightly colored sticky notes, shaped like arrows pointing directly to the empty signature lines. He kept his hands flat against the documents, deliberately trying to obscure the bold legal headers printed at the very top of each page, but Victor's intelligence report had already told me exactly what those papers contained. As the documents hit the table, the physical dynamic within the grand living room shifted with terrifying synchronized precision. My 4 children abandoned their casual positions and slowly closed the perimeter around my wheelchair. They moved with the silent, coordinated grace of a hunting pack surrounding a wounded deer. Rachel abandoned her spot by the stone fireplace and stepped directly into the wide archway, physically blocking the only exit leading to the dining room. Derek moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Gregory, his muscular frame casting a long, dark shadow over the coffee table. Megan stepped directly behind my wheelchair, her hands gripping the rubber handles with absolute unyielding force, anchoring me firmly in place. Thomas remained standing directly over me, radiating a suffocating, aggressive energy. They formed a solid human wall, completely trapping me in the absolute center of the room. I looked up at their faces. The masks of concerned, loving children had completely slipped away. Their features were drawn tight, their eyes hard, and totally devoid of any genuine human warmth. Their smiles were stiff-forced and undeniably predatory. The air in the room grew incredibly dense, heavy with their silent, demanding expectation. Thomas reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact pen I received for my 50th birthday, a symbol of my hard-earned corporate legacy. Thomas uncapped the pen with a smooth, practiced motion and leaned down until his face was mere inches from mine. I could clearly smell the bitter espresso lingering on his breath. "Just sign right here, Dad," Thomas commanded softly, his voice dropping the facade of gentle persuasion and adopting a tone of cold, absolute authority. "It just gives me the legal permission to handle all your complicated hospital bills and manage your grueling insurance claims so you can finally just rest. You do not need to worry about any of this tedious paperwork anymore. I am going to take total control of everything from here on out." He pushed the heavy legal documents closer to the edge of the glass table, tapping a manicured finger directly on the bright yellow sticky note. He reached out and forcefully pressed the cold, gold-plated fountain pen directly into my open right palm. His strong fingers wrapped around my frail, trembling hand, squeezing my knuckles with aggressive, completely undeniable pressure, silently demanding my absolute obedience. I stared down at the documents resting on the glass table. Even through my half-closed eyes, I could clearly read the bold, capitalized words printed at the very top of the pages. Irrevocable power of attorney. Direct quitclaim deed transfer. They were literally asking me to sign my own execution order. My heart slammed violently against my healing ribs, a furious, burning rage screaming for me to stand up and destroy them all. Instead, I channeled every ounce of that explosive fury into a violent, uncontrollable physical tremor. I let my hand shake wildly. I loosened my grip, allowing the heavy gold fountain pen to slip right through my fingers. The expensive pen hit the glass table with a loud clatter and rolled onto the Persian rug. I looked up at Thomas, my eyes wide, vacant, and filled with manufactured panic. "I cannot see the lines, Thomas," I whispered, my voice breaking completely. "My eyes are so blurry." Thomas let out a sharp, frustrated breath, though he quickly masked it with a tight, strained smile. He knelt on the expensive Persian rug, retrieved the heavy gold fountain pen, and stood back up, wiping the barrel with his thumb. "It is perfectly fine, Dad," Thomas said, his voice tightening with a highly controlled, simmering edge. "You do not need to read the fine print. I have already reviewed every single page with the legal team. It is just standard hospital boilerplate. I just need your signature on the bottom line." He pressed the pen back into my trembling hand, wrapping my numb fingers around the cold metal chassis. I let out a weak, pathetic groan, letting my head roll slightly to the side. "The lighting in here is terrible," I murmured, squinting my eyes as if I were struggling to focus on the documents resting on the glass table. I cannot see where the paper ends and the table begins. The winter glare from the windows is blinding me. Megan, please draw the heavy curtains. The bright light is giving me a terrible pounding migraine. Megan let out a loud dramatic sigh of pure exasperation, throwing her hands up in the air. For heaven's sake, she muttered under her breath, her high heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor as she stomped over to the tall windows. She yanked the heavy velvet drapes shut, plunging the grand living room into a dim, muted shadow. Is that better? She snapped, her tone entirely devoid of any real daughterly affection. Let us just get this over with, please. I have a luncheon at 1 today, and we are dragging this tedious process out forever. I blinked slowly in the newly dimmed light, letting my mouth hang open in a display of profound, geriatric confusion. Now it is far too dark, I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and raspy. I cannot possibly read a legal document in the dark. And my throat is so incredibly dry from the medication. I cannot swallow. I need a glass of water before I can concentrate on anything. Derek, please fetch me some ice water. My chest is burning again. Derek clenched his massive fists, his jaw muscles feathering, as he glared at me with absolute undisguised contempt. He looked at Thomas silently, asking for permission to ignore my request. Thomas gave him a sharp, furious nod, silently communicating that they needed to appease my final pathetic demands to secure the ultimate prize. Derek spun around and stormed into the adjacent kitchen. He returned 30 seconds later, holding a heavy crystal tumbler filled with ice water. He practically shoved the heavy glass into my hands, spilling a few freezing drops onto the thick wool blanket draped across my lap. I gripped the crystal tumbler with both hands, letting them shake violently. I brought the glass to my dry lips, taking a slow, agonizingly small sip. I let the cold water trickle down my chin, ensuring I looked exactly like a man who had completely lost control of his basic motor functions. I took another painfully slow sip, deliberately testing the absolute limits of their rapidly fraying patience. I could literally hear Gregory, the fraudulent doctor, breathing heavily behind the table, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His cheap suit rustled loudly as he continually wiped the nervous sweat from his pale forehead. He was clearly terrified that this elaborate, highly illegal charade was going to completely fall apart, and he desperately wanted his bribe money immediately. I finally lowered this glass, letting it rest precariously on the arm of my wheelchair. I looked back down at the dense legal paperwork spread out across the coffee table. Thomas leaned in close once again, his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp smell of his bitter espresso. The pen, Dad. Thomas urged, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. Just sign the bottom of the yellow sticky note. It is right there. I guided my shaking hand toward the paper, letting the nib of the fountain pen hover just a fraction of an inch above the thick white bond. But then I paused. I pulled my hand back, letting my brow furrow in deep manufactured confusion. Wait! I mumbled, pointing a trembling finger at the bold header of the second document. What does this word mean? Thomas. It says irrevocable. Why does a routine hospital release form need to be irrevocable? And why does it distinctly mention the primary estate deeds? My head hurts far too much to understand this complicated legal terminology. I think we should call Mitchell. Yes, call my attorney. Mitchell will know exactly what these papers genuinely mean. I am not signing absolutely anything until Mitchell reads them first. The mere mention of my fiercely loyal corporate attorney was the absolute breaking point. The incredibly fragile, carefully constructed illusion of a loving family gathering shattered into a million jagged pieces. The suffocating tension in the grand living room finally snapped with the violent force of a breaking steel cable. Thomas completely abandoned the charade. The gentle, concerned son vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless, greedy predator I had watched on the hidden camera the night before. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, his eyes burning with a dark, malicious fire. Thomas slammed both of his hands down hard onto the padded armrests of my wheelchair, his face inches from mine. The sudden violent impact shook my entire body, sending a sharp spike of genuine pain through my healing sternum, but I did not flinch. I stared directly into his furious, hateful eyes. "Sign the damn paper, old man," Thomas hissed, his voice trembling with explosive, venomous anger. "We are entirely done playing these pathetic, endless games with you. You are half dead anyway. You have absolutely no idea what is happening around you, and you have no power left in this house. You are going to give me the legal authority right now. Do not make me force your hand to write your own name." Gregory took a terrified step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the Persian rug. "This is highly irregular." Thomas, the fake notary, stammered, his voice pitching high with sheer panic. "You said he was going to be compliant. You said the heavy sedatives would make him perfectly docile. I am not getting involved in a physical altercation." "Shut your mouth, Gregory!" Derek barked, stepping aggressively into the fake doctor right in his face and shoved him hard backwards. "You are getting paid a massive amount of money to stand there and stamp the paper. So stand there and shut up." Megan crossed her arms, staring down at me with absolute disgust. "He is losing his mind," she sneered coldly. "We should have never let him wake up from the coma. He is just making this incredibly difficult for no reason at all." Rachel stepped out from the shadows and walked over to my wheelchair. "Just grab his wrist and do it, Thomas," Rachel scoffed, her voice echoing through the silent room. "He will not even remember this tomorrow." I let the heavy silence of the living room stretch out for a few agonizing seconds, allowing my plea to hang suspended in the winter air. I kept my head bowed, my shoulders hunched, completely enveloped in the crafted illusion of a broken patriarch. My eyes remained half shut, but my vision was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. I slowly shifted my gaze, looking at each of my 4 children, permanently etching their cruel faces into the darkest vault of my memory. I wanted to remember this exact moment for the rest of my natural life. I looked at Derek, his massive frame radiating violent energy, ready to physically force my compliance. I looked at Rachel, leaning impatiently against the archway, her face twisted with disgust, caring only about the loan sharks waiting for their blood money. I looked at Megan, standing behind my wheelchair, her hands gripping the handles like a prison warden, entirely devoid of any compassion. And finally, I looked up at Thomas. My eldest son, my chosen successor, the devious architect of my chemical torture. He was staring down at me with an expression of absolute, unadulterated contempt. He was a predator, anticipating the final twitch of his prey. He did not see a beloved father. He saw a convenient signature. He saw $40 million and a corporate empire he was entirely too weak to build himself. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal pulsed through my veins, but the frantic rage that had consumed me the night before was completely gone. It was entirely replaced by an ocean of freezing absolute certainty. The time for cowardly deception was finally over. The pathetic theater production had officially reached its final, inevitable curtain call. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, stale air of the grand living room, completely ignoring the sharp, residual ache radiating from my healing sternum. I centered my focus, gathering every ounce of physical strength I had secretly preserved during my agonizing days of silent observation. The violent, manufactured trembling in my right hand began to slow. The frantic shaking gradually subsided into a steady, powerfully controlled stillness. I rested my hand flat against the heavy wool blanket draped across my lap. The sudden cessation of my physical panic was so abrupt, so entirely unnatural for a terrified, heavily medicated invalid, that the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Thomas narrowed his eyes, a faint ripple of confusion breaking through his rigid mask of absolute authority. He glanced down at the gold fountain pen resting on the Persian rug, then back up to my face. He opened his mouth to issue another harsh command, to aggressively demand that I pick up the pen and sign away my existence, but the words completely died in his throat. With terrifying fluidity, I grabbed the outer edges of the thick wool blanket with both hands. I did not move with the hesitant, agonizing slowness of an elderly man recovering from a catastrophic cardiovascular event. I moved with explosive, focused power. I threw the heavy blanket violently aside, sending it cascading over the armrest of the wheelchair, to land in a crumpled, discarded heap on the floor. I planted my bare feet firmly onto the intricate woven patterns of the expensive Persian rug, feeling the solid, unyielding floor beneath my soles. I gripped the armrests tightly, locked my jaw, and pushed my entire body upward. There was absolutely no trembling. There was no hesitation. There was absolutely no physical weakness. I stood up perfectly straight, extending my spine to its full commanding height. The frail, broken old man, who had been wheeled into this room mere moments ago, vanished completely, evaporating into the cold morning air like formless smoke. The ruthless 70-year-old corporate titan, who had conquered the unforgiving Chicago real estate world, returned, filling the grand living room with an aura of absolute, terrifying dominance. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the phantom pain in my chest, and towered over the heavy glass coffee table. The immediate reaction from my treacherous children was profoundly satisfying. The collective shock hit them like a physical shockwave. Derek stumbled backward, his heavy boots tangling in the fringe of the rug, his mouth falling open in sheer, uncomprehending horror. Rachel let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her manicured hands flat against the cold stone of the fireplace, her eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing fear. Megan physically recoiled, releasing the handles of my wheelchair, as if the rubber grips had suddenly caught fire. She took 3 rapid steps away from me, her face draining of all natural color, until she looked like a terrified ghost. But my attention was completely locked on Thomas. He stood frozen on the opposite side of the glass table, his confident, predatory stance collapsing into a posture of absolute ruin. The color washed from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes darted frantically, desperately searching my face for the compliant, brain-damaged invalid he thought he had successfully created. He found absolutely nothing but cold, calculating murder staring back at him. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic as his brilliant, flawless conspiracy shattered into jagged pieces right in front of his eyes. Gregory, the fraudulent doctor, let out a pathetic whimper, backing away toward the front foyer, his cheap briefcase completely forgotten on the table. No one moved to stop him. The entire room was paralyzed, trapped in the terrifying gravitational pull of my sudden, impossible resurrection. I looked down at the dense legal documents spread across the table, at the bright yellow sticky notes pointing to my financial execution. I reached down, not with a trembling hand, but with the steady, unyielding grip of a conqueror, and picked up the irrevocable power of attorney. I held the crisp paper in the air for a single second, before slowly, deliberately tearing it perfectly in half, letting the destroyed pieces flutter down onto the glass. Thomas took a shaky, uncertain breath, his voice barely a whisper when he finally managed to speak. "Dad," he stammered, his hands rising defensively in front of his chest. "Dad, you are not well. You are confused. You are experiencing a post-surgical hallucination. You need to sit back down before you completely exhaust your heart." I stepped around the coffee table, closing the distance between us, until I was standing merely inches away from his trembling frame. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. "I am not confused, Thomas," I whispered. I leaned closer, ensuring he saw the absence of mercy in my eyes. "I know exactly what you did to my company. I know exactly what you did to the pension funds, and I know exactly what you paid that medical assistant to pump into my veins. I remember everything." Before Thomas could process the destruction of his entire world or formulate a pathetic excuse, a thunderous impact shattered the quiet morning. The heavy oak doors of the estate were blown entirely off their steel hinges with a deafening, catastrophic crash. A cloud of splintered wood and pulverized plaster billowed into the grand foyer, instantly filling the pristine, climate-controlled air with the sharp, acrid scent of destruction. The sheer concussive force of the breach rattled the expensive crystal chandeliers hanging above our heads and sent a series of priceless porcelain vases crashing from their pedestals onto the marble floor. Through the swirling gray dust and the chaotic ringing echo of the impact, a figure strode confidently into my home. It was Mitchell. My fiercely loyal corporate attorney did not look like a man who had been unceremoniously fired and escorted off the premises just days prior. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair immaculate, his posture radiating an aura of absolute unyielding legal authority. But Mitchell was not alone. Flanking him on either side, moving with terrifying synchronized military precision, were 6 heavily armed tactical agents, wearing dark ballistic vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Specifically, they were the elite operatives of the Financial Crimes Unit, the absolute last people any corrupt corporate raider ever wanted to see, standing inside their living room. The agents fanned out across the grand living room in a matter of seconds, their heavy tactical boots crunching over the Persian rug, as they immediately secured all the primary exits and completely locked down the entire perimeter of the estate. The immediate visceral reaction from my treacherous children was a spectacle of profound, deeply satisfying poetic justice. The arrogant, suffocating control they had projected just moments ago instantly evaporated, replaced by raw, primal panic. Rachel let out a piercing, hysterical scream, stumbling backward away from the fireplace. She wrapped her arms around her head, shrinking into the corner like a terrified child. Megan stood completely frozen behind my empty wheelchair, her eyes wide and unblinking, her jaw trembling violently as she stared at the federal agents pouring into the room. She looked exactly like a ghost who had suddenly realized she was trapped in the physical world. But it was Derek who broke the paralyzing spell of shock. The massive, muscular athlete, the golden child who had physically intimidated me just minutes prior, took one look at the federal badges and let his cowardice entirely consume him. He spun on his heels, abandoning his siblings without a single second of hesitation, and sprinted frantically toward the glass French doors leading to the rear patio. He kicked a decorative side table out of his way, desperately lunging for the brass handle to escape into the freezing winter garden. He did not make it. The lead tactical agent moved with breathtaking, calculated speed. He intercepted my youngest son halfway across the room, dropping his shoulder and driving his entire body weight directly into Derek. The impact was incredibly loud. Derek was lifted completely off his feet and driven violently down into the solid hardwood floor. The heavy thud of his massive frame hitting the polished oak echoed through the room, followed instantly by the sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs being tightly secured around his wrists. Derek groaned in pain, his face pressed firmly against the expensive floorboards, completely immobilized and thoroughly humiliated. He writhed weakly against the agent holding him down, but the fight had been entirely knocked out of his system. The invincible, arrogant brute was now just a pathetic, captured criminal. Seeing Derek completely neutralized on the floor pushed Gregory, the fraudulent medical specialist, over the absolute edge of his fragile sanity. The fake doctor realized with horrifying clarity that he was standing in the very center of a massive coordinated federal raid, holding a briefcase full of forged documents that carried decades of mandatory prison time. Gregory let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper and threw his hands straight up into the air, surrendering to the room at large. His cheap, scuffed leather briefcase slipped from his sweaty fingers, hitting the glass coffee table and popping entirely open. The thick stack of forged Medicare release forms the irrevocable power of attorney, and the fraudulent quitclaim deed scattered chaotically across the glass surface. "Please do not shoot me," Gregory babbled hysterically, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his pale, sweating face. "I am not a real doctor. I am just a public notary. Thomas paid me $50,000 in cash to stamp those papers. He told me the old man was chemically sedated and completely unaware of his surroundings. I did not want to do it, but he said I would be ruined if I refused. It was all his idea." Thomas and Derek organized the entire operation, Please, I will testify to absolutely everything. I will tell you everything you want to know. Just give me a plea deal." Mitchell stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching over a stray piece of shattered porcelain. He looked at Gregory with an expression of profound professional disgust, then slowly turned his sharp, calculating gaze directly onto my eldest son. Thomas was standing by the coffee table, his chest heaving, his immaculate silk tie slightly askew. He was watching his entire conspiracy, his grand $40 million theft, publicly unravel in a matter of seconds. The walls were rapidly closing in, but Thomas was too arrogant, too deeply entrenched in his own manufactured delusion of power, to recognize that he had already completely lost the war. Instead of surrendering like the cowardly notary, or fleeing like his foolish younger brother Thomas attempted to mount a final desperate stand, he puffed out his chest completely, ignoring the armed federal agents surrounding him, and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Mitchell. "What the hell do you think you are doing breaking into my property?" Thomas screamed, his voice echoing shrilly, entirely stripped of its usual calm authority. "You have absolutely no legal right to be here, Mitchell. You were fired by the executive board 2 weeks ago. You are trespassing on private property. I demand that you call off these agents immediately before I have you arrested for breaking and entering." Mitchell did not say a single word. He simply arched an elegant silver eyebrow and looked at me, a silent, knowing communication passing between us. Thomas saw the look, and his fury completely boiled over. He took a threatening step toward the center of the room, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "This is my house," Thomas shouted, the veins bulging visibly against the side of his flushed neck. "He is severely incapacitated, and I have a legally binding emergency medical power of attorney. I am the sole legal proxy for Richard Harrison, and I am officially ordering all of you out of my home right this second." The silence that followed his desperate screaming demand was incredibly heavy, broken only by the muffled, pathetic sobs coming from Rachel. I took a slow, deliberate breath, enjoying the absolute terrifying stillness that had fallen over my grand living room. I reached slowly inside the interior breast pocket of my tailored wool jacket. I stepped forward into the very center of the shattered room, calmly pulling a crisp, officially stamped legal folder from deep inside my jacket. I held the crisp, stamped legal folder in my steady right hand, letting the silence of the room amplify the reality of my absolute control. I did not break eye contact with Thomas as I stepped up to the edge of the glass coffee table. I raised my hand and let the manila folder drop flat onto the surface, landing right on top of Gregory and his fraudulent paperwork. The sharp slap of the cardstock echoed like a judge bringing down his wooden gavel for the final time. Thomas stared at the folder, his chest heaving, a tiny bead of sweat tracing a slow line down his pale, rigid face. "Your temporary power of attorney was flagged as fraudulent and suspended exactly 48 hours ago, Thomas Fish," said, my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level. I watched his eyes widen in pure terror as my words finally pierced his thick armor of manufactured arrogance. "And while you and your siblings were busy trying to steal the roof over my head, with cheap parlor tricks, Mitchell and I successfully isolated your entire corporate leverage." Thomas opened his mouth, trying to form a coherent sentence, but only a weak, breathless rasp escaped his throat. He looked frantically toward Mitchell, who simply stood with his hands clasped firmly behind his back, flanked by the armed tactical agents. Mitchell offered a cold, satisfied nod, confirming the absolute destruction of my son and his criminal empire. "You honestly believed you were a brilliant corporate raider." Thomas, I continued, pacing slowly around the coffee table. "You thought you could simply forge my digital signature mortgage, my logistics fleet, and drain the hard-earned pension funds of my employees to cover the pathetic disasters of your siblings. You believed the corporate liability shield would perfectly protect you from the massive high-interest loans you illegally secured. But you are not a brilliant businessman, Thomas. You are just a greedy, impatient child playing a dangerous game you do not understand." I paused, letting the crushing weight of his monumental failure settle onto his drooping shoulders. "Because you utilized forged biometric signatures to secure those massive private equity loans, the corporate veil of protection was instantly pierced," I explained. Mitchell and his legal team initiated an emergency severance protocol the moment we accessed your shadow servers. We legally separated the logistics company from the fraudulent debts you created. The millions of dollars in outstanding corporate debt you recklessly took out using my life's work as collateral have been entirely severed from the business entity. You did not steal my wealth. You only stole an illusion. Rachel let out a sharp, horrified gasp, her hands flying up to cover her trembling mouth. Derek groaned loudly from his position pinned against the hardwood floor, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of the trap they had blindly walked into. Those massive suffocating debts are no longer attached to my company, I said, raising my voice so it resonated clearly off the vaulted ceilings. Those debts are now legally permanently and irrevocably pinned directly to your personal Social Security numbers. Every single forged document you signed made you personally liable for the stolen funds. You do not own a $40 million corporate empire. You do not own this beautiful historic estate. You do not own absolutely anything. You only own massive, deeply crippling financial debt. The horrifying scope of their new reality washed over the room like a tidal wave of freezing water. Rachel stumbled away from the stone fireplace, her knees buckling beneath her expensive designer dress. But the syndicate, she wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. The money we sent to the Port District, we paid them, Dad. We sent the pension funds to clear my dangerous underground ledgers. Mitchell stepped forward, his polished shoes shining in the dim morning light. The federal authorities intercepted and completely froze those offshore wire transfers late last night. Mitchell stated, his voice a weapon of professional authority. The underground lending syndicate did not receive a single penny of the stolen employee pension funds. And the Financial Crimes Unit is currently raiding their Port District operations, based on the digital breadcrumbs you foolishly left on your unencrypted servers. Rachel let out a guttural, terrifying scream of pure despair. The loan sharks had not been paid. She was entirely exposed, entirely bankrupt, and now intimately connected to a massive federal investigation. She collapsed onto the Persian rug, clutching the fabric of her dress, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Megan, who had been standing frozen behind my empty wheelchair, completely broke down. The reality of federal prison combined with financial ruin shattered her carefully maintained facade of sophisticated superiority. She dropped heavily onto her bare knees, crawling desperately across the carpet toward where I stood. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my tailored wool trousers. Dad! Please, Megan screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. Please forgive us. Do not let them do this to us. You are our father. Please, Dad, I am begging you. Please just help us. Rachel joined the chorus of pathetic weeping, her hands clasped in desperate prayer. Daddy, please, she sobbed. They are going to kill me. They are going to find me and kill me. Please, I need your help. We need our father. Thomas stood paralyzed by the coffee table, his eyes locked onto the torn pieces of the power of attorney. Federal agents shoved him against the wall. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoing behind his back was the only sound he made. I looked down at Megan and Rachel, weeping and begging at my feet. I looked at Derek, humiliated and restrained on the floor. I looked at Thomas, stripped of all power and facing decades behind cold steel bars. I searched for a single shred of paternal pity, a fleeting ember of the profound love that had driven me to build this empire for their benefit. I found absolutely nothing. The internal void was completely hollow. I stared down at the pathetic, broken creatures sobbing on my Persian rug with zero emotion. My face was a mask of cold stone. You chemically tortured me. I whispered, my voice cutting through their crying with razor-sharp precision. You intentionally locked me inside my own mind, slowly poisoning my blood, so you could steal the very legacy I built with my bare hands. You happily traded my life for your greed. I stepped back, pulling my leg away before Megan could touch my trousers. I straightened my suit jacket, adjusted my cuffs, and looked at them one final time. You wanted me in a coma, I said, delivering the words with the terrifying absolute finality of a closing coffin lid. Consider me dead. I turned my back on my weeping children and walked steadily toward the completely destroyed front entrance of the estate. The freezing cold winter wind washed over my face, sharp, clarifying, and incredibly pure. I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked straight out the front door, leaving them entirely to the armed federal agents finally free. 6 months later, the bright spring sun illuminated the towering glass facade of the newly constructed charitable clinic in the heart of downtown Chicago. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing as I stood on the pristine concrete steps, looking up at the massive steel letters mounted above the main entrance. The Harrison Foundation Medical Center. It was a state-of-the-art facility built entirely from the ground up, dedicated exclusively to providing comprehensive world-class cardiovascular care to underprivileged families across the city. There were no hidden agendas here, no corporate raiders hiding in the shadows, and absolutely no greedy children waiting to steal the building materials. It was a pure, uncorrupted legacy of healing. A gentle, warm breeze ruffled the edge of my tailored navy blue suit as I adjusted my silk tie. I felt stronger, healthier, and more intensely alive than I had in over a decade. The agonizing, chemically induced weakness that had plagued my body 6 months ago was nothing more than a fading memory. The doctors had successfully flushed every trace of his toxic sedatives from my bloodstream. My mind was sharp, my heart beat with a steady rhythmic power, and my soul was completely at peace. Standing directly to my right, wearing a perfectly pressed white administrative coat, was Nurse Isabella Ramirez. The brilliant, deeply compassionate woman who had risked her own career to save my life was no longer working double shifts in a corrupt hospital ward. She was now the head director of this entire medical facility, personally managing a staff of over 200 dedicated healthcare professionals. I had given her complete operational control, trusting her impeccable ethics and her fierce dedication to patient advocacy. Isabella smiled warmly at me, holding a pair of large ceremonial silver scissors. "Are you ready, Richard?" she asked, her voice carrying a tone of deep, genuine respect. The local press corps was gathered at the bottom of the wide steps, their cameras flashing rapidly, capturing the triumphant conclusion of a highly publicized corporate rebirth. I nodded slowly, returning her bright smile. "I am more than ready, Isabella," I replied confidently. I reached out and grasped the handles of the silver scissors together with her. We positioned the gleaming blades around the thick, bright red ribbon stretched tightly across the main entrance. The crowd fell silent in eager anticipation. With a single, smooth motion, we snipped the ribbon in half. The heavy fabric fell away, fluttering gracefully to the clean concrete floor. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, cheering loudly for the opening of a medical center that would save thousands of vulnerable lives. I turned to Isabella and shook her hand, feeling a profound, deeply resonant sense of absolute accomplishment. As the journalists began packing their equipment and the distinguished guests moved inside to tour the pristine new lobby, I felt a familiar, subtle vibration in the breast pocket of my suit jacket. I reached inside and slowly pulled out my mobile phone. The screen illuminated, displaying a breaking news alert from a major national media outlet. The bold black text scrolled across the glowing screen with undeniable concrete finality. Harrison's siblings sentenced to 12 years in federal fraud and forgery case. I stared at the glowing words for a long moment, feeling the cool glass of the screen beneath my thumb. There was no sudden surge of paternal grief. There was no lingering regret. The 4 individuals who had smiled as they planned my execution had faced the absolute crushing weight of federal justice. They had lost their extravagant homes, their unearned wealth, and their freedom. They were completely ruined, trapped in tiny concrete cells, left to ponder their unimaginable greed for over a decade. This was the ultimate, satisfying triumph over betrayal. I had successfully severed the toxic roots that threatened to choke the future, ensuring my hard-earned resources would directly benefit those who genuinely needed them. The grateful city would remember the Harrison name not for the scandalous greed of my treacherous children, but for the profound medical miracles performed within these very walls. I stood completely still on the concrete steps, allowing the bright morning sunlight to wash over my face, feeling the magnificent warmth of a perfectly executed victory. I gently swiped the notification away, clearing the screen until it was entirely blank. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without a single second glance. I had lost my biological family, but I had successfully protected my soul, my corporate empire, and my true enduring legacy. I looked up at the towering glass building, listening to the joyful, hopeful voices echoing from within its clean, bright halls. A calm, deeply victorious smile spread across my face as the shadows of the past faded completely into black. Blood makes you relatives, but loyalty, respect, and integrity make you true family. We often blind ourselves to the toxic nature of those closest to us, excusing their greed as mere flaws. But a true parent must recognize when providing becomes enabling, and when love requires holding predators accountable, even if they are your own children. True wealth is not merely measured by the millions in a bank account, but by the dignity of your soul and the positive impact you leave behind. Sometimes you must let the old bridges burn completely to light the path toward your true legacy. If Richard's ultimate revenge sent cold chills down your spine, smash that like button. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe now to our channel for more jaw-dropping life stories and satisfying justice.